We meet again. My name is Ryan, and I would like to welcome you back to week 2 out of our series from the book of Nehemiah that we have cleverly titled Nehemiah. God named the book, so kind of took care of that for us. This series has one singular purpose. We're only going to be here for 4 weeks. That's a short shot series for us. We're used to really taking our time. We're only going to be here for 4 weeks. Please find your seat. Stop having fun. There's a lot of energy in the building today. I do like that. But this series, if you're hopping in for the first time, this series has one singular purpose behind it, and that is to help you find and accomplish God's will for your life. That's it. That's what every one of these 4 weeks is all about. One of the things that's really unique about this series is that each teaching is going to build directly off the one that came right before it. So before we get into what we're going to get into today, let me just real quickly recap where we've been. So last week we started the story of Nehemiah. It begins with Nehemiah hearing this report about how things were going back in his hometown. Nehemiah was a Jew, but he was living in Persian captivity in a place called Susa, which is modern-day Iran. It's about 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem. And the report that he heard was that Jerusalem, the city where his fathers were buried, is still in shambles. Its wall has been torn down. It's been that way for 140 years. They can't really get any traction there. And the people are living in a constant state of disgrace because of it. So simply in hearing that news, Nehemiah completely crumbled. He wept. So the first thing that we saw in his life is this passion, this burden that God had placed on his heart. But more than just being really sad, what we saw Nehemiah do next with that passion is take it back to God. And so he winds up praying about this need that God had made so near and dear to him. And he winds up praying actually for 5 months about it. But again, more than just being really sad and praying really hard, what we saw last week was that Nehemiah, after being moved with passion and moved to prayer, was moved to action. Nehemiah had access to the king of Persia as the king's cupbearer. And so he's in the king's presence. And he looks really sad one day. And the king asks Nehemiah, well, what's on your mind? And Nehemiah says, you know, there's these problems back in Jerusalem, the city where my fathers are buried. The wall's still torn down. Why shouldn't I be sad? And so last week we ended with this scene where the king, upon hearing what's on Nehemiah's mind and on his heart, actually the king asked Nehemiah, what are you requesting? What are you willing to do about it? And Nehemiah responds by saying, I want you to send me over there to do something about this myself. I'm going to personally attend to this issue. So that's the beginning of the story of Nehemiah, and that's what we covered last week. So last week's teaching was, it answered the question, how do I find God's will for my life, by looking at that progression in Nehemiah's life. And there was really 3 ideas we pulled out of the text. The first step in finding God's will for your life is, first off, finding your passion. Finding out what God has uniquely designed you to care deeply about. For Nehemiah, that was rebuilding this wall. It's different for every one of us, but that's really the first step in finding God's will. The second step is taking that passion, whatever that is, back to God in prayer. And then the third step, finally, is taking action, doing something about it. So this morning, we're going to drill down on that last idea, that idea of taking action, and we're going to look at exactly what kind of action we need to take. So last week's talk answered the question, how do I find God's will for my life? This week's talk is going to answer the question, what are my next steps once I have found it? So if you're listening to this and you have an idea of what God has designed you to care about, you have an idea of what God has really, by his design, uniquely wired you to have a burden for, and you've asked the question, well, what am I supposed to do about it now? This teaching is designed specifically for you. And we are going to get, this whole series is pretty practical, but today, this is as practical as I ever get teaching-wise. So if you're into that style of teaching, great. If not, at least we have donuts at the coffee bar. I don't know what else to tell you, okay? So what are the next steps once you have found God's will for your life? There's 4 answers to that question in this passage from Nehemiah. The first and most foundational thing that you and I have to do once we have found what God has uniquely wired us to care about is going to be our first idea today. Number 1, we have to be able to clearly define the mission. We're going to pick it up right where we left off in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4. Nehemiah writes, "Then the king asked me, what is your request?" So let me just pause here. Nehemiah has been praying for this thing that God laid on his heart for 5 months. It physically is affecting him. He cares so deeply about it. So he's in the presence of the king. The king asks Nehemiah, what's wrong? Nehemiah says, this is what's wrong. Things are bad back home. And so here the king is asking Nehemiah, what is your request? It says, so I prayed to the God of heaven and answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried so that I may rebuild it. So what we're seeing there is that in response to God laying this incredible burden on Nehemiah's life, on his heart, and in response to this incredible opportunity that God has laid in Nehemiah's lap, the very first thing that he did in response to what God had done in him was to clearly define the mission. Now, the fact that Nehemiah was even able to do this, it was really the product of what we saw him doing last week. He heard this news. It affected him deeply. He had this passion. He took it to God for 5 months in prayer. But really, the way that I read this story, everything rode on Nehemiah's ability to do what we're talking about right here. Right? Just imagine, because the fact that this story has even gone like this is kind of ridiculous in and of itself. Just keep this in mind. Nehemiah's a cupbearer. The king is the king. The king in this story is asking the cupbearer, what is your request? That's not a question that kings historically ask cupbearers. That's something cupbearers ask kings. But that's the result of Nehemiah going to God. That's what happens when we go to God with our passion. He opens up doors in our life. He makes opportunities available to us that wouldn't otherwise be possible. But if Nehemiah had choked here, then all of that caring, all of that crying, all of that praying really wouldn't have amounted to anything if he wasn't able to straightforwardly answer the king's question right here. But Nehemiah knew that after God had laid this passion on his heart and defined that conviction of his through prayer, now it was time for Nehemiah to respond to what God had done in him. And the very first step was to clearly define his mission. And it's exactly as important in our lives. So I just want to ask you before we move forward, and really, this is the question that this whole series demands that you and I ask of yourselves. Let me ask you to ask yourself now, what is God calling you to do? I know this. I know there is an answer to that question. I know there is no such thing as a child of God who's not been given a purpose by God. It's just a matter of whether or not you and I know that. What is God calling you to do? Maybe God is calling you to, for the very first time in your life, put your trust in Jesus to be your Savior. There's not a mission in the world greater than that. But maybe you're listening to this, you've been investigating, you've been kind of testing the waters, figuring out if this is for you, and you've heard some things that you've never heard before, and maybe God's working on you, and you can't really explain it, you don't totally understand it, but you can't shake it. You know, he keeps bringing these people into your life or these thoughts or these ideas into your head, and maybe for the very first time in your life, what God is calling you to do today is to stop playing around, go all in on this, and put your trust in Jesus to save you. Not a mission in the world greater than that one. Maybe you've already done that. And what God is calling you to do, though, is to, for the first time, maybe ever, start paying attention to some things that are going on in your life. Or maybe there's a sin habit that has taken root in your life for way too long. Maybe you haven't really been honest with anybody else about it. Maybe you haven't even really been honest with yourself about it, but God is calling you to face it, to own it, and to begin putting it to death so that you can be the person that he desires you to be and the person that the people around you need you to be. All right, maybe your mission has something to do with what's going on under your roof. Maybe it has something to do with you and your spouse or you and your kids, even you and your finances. Maybe God's calling you to a place of service right here in this church, like investing your time and your life in the next generation. I don't know if you've looked around here. There's no shortage of kids in this church. What there is a shortage of, though, is adults that are willing to volunteer their time for the sake of those kids so that they can hear what God has done for them in Jesus and all that it means to walk in light of the gospel. Or maybe, like Nehemiah, God's calling you to some cause, to some need, to some issue outside the four walls of the church. God could be calling you to absolutely anything. The point is, once you and I have an idea of the burden that God has placed on our hearts, his calling on our life, our very first responsibility is to be able to clearly define the mission. Here's why that's the first thing we see in this story, and here's why that's so important. Your ability to clearly define whatever it is that God's calling you to do allows you to do really two things. First and most obviously, it allows you to identify what you are going to do. Not really breaking new ground there. I didn't expect anybody to fall out of the maroon chair on that one. But secondly, and exactly as importantly, being able to clearly define the mission allows you to know what you are absolutely not going to do. And sometimes that's more important even than knowing what you need to do. And so for Nehemiah, in being able to answer the king's question so straightforwardly and knowing why God put him on earth at that time, what that did is it allowed him to not get distracted with a whole bunch of good ideas that would not have been the right ideas. So step one in walking in obedience to the call that God's placed on our life is number one, clearly defining the mission. But obviously, that's not an end in and of itself. So what do you do after that? Once you can clearly define your mission, what's the next step? It's our second idea this morning. Number two, you have to be able to carefully make the plans. And this is exactly what we see next in the life of Nehemiah. I'm going to pick it up in verse 6. It says, "The king, with the queen seated beside him, asked me, 'How long will your journey take, and when will you return?' So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me." That little detail at the end there caught my attention. It's really noteworthy to me that this story says that it pleased the king to send Nehemiah directly after Nehemiah was able to answer the king's question by giving him a definite time. Because I'm convinced that if in response to that question, Nehemiah had said, "Man, I hadn't even thought about that. That's a great question. No idea. Could be a week, could be a decade, who knows, king?" I guarantee you the king would have answered back and said, "All right, well, you're clearly not serious about this. I don't know why I should be. That's the end of this vision. You're going to go back to wine testing for the king." And that's the end of Nehemiah's story. But evidently, in those 5 months that he was taking his burden before God, like we saw last week, evidently during that 5-month period, Nehemiah was putting some analytical thought into what God was calling him to do. And so not only did he answer the king's question, he actually had a few questions of his own. In verse 7, we read, "I also said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates River, so that they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress, the city wall, and the home where I will live.' The king granted my requests, for I was graciously strengthened by my God." So what you're reading there is that Nehemiah not only had figured out exactly how long this project was going to take him, he made sure that he would be safe getting to where he was going, and that he would have all the supplies that he needed to get started once he got there. In other words, Nehemiah carefully made the plans. Interestingly enough, what I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed as well, is that a lot of times the idea of trusting God versus having a plan can sometimes be seen as diametrically opposed ideas. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I have. I've actually talked to other church leaders at other churches that believe that it is not right to have a plan to reach people outside the four walls of the church, because that's God's business and he's going to take care of that, and we're not going to, develop a strategy or anything like that. And that's fine, but I just want everybody to know, so we're on the same page, that we do not think like that here. I don't think like that. This church exists to do one thing and one thing only. That is make disciples. That's the only thing we exist to do, because that's the one thing that Jesus said we exist to do. And when you die and come back to life, you're in charge. Like, that's the rubric. So this is Jesus' church. He gets to call the shots. And so everything we do with that one thing in mind, to make disciples. We just want to see lives transformed by Jesus. But instead of just talking about how great it would be if that happened, what we've done here is we've actually developed a plan. And that's what we call our discipleship process. And we've really designed our entire church around that. So we believe, based on what we see in the Bible, that disciples are people who, first off, love God. Second off, are growing together in relationship with God's people. And thirdly, are serving the people that God has placed in their life. And so we offer weekend worship services to help people grow in their love for God, small groups to help them grow together with God's people, and serve teams so that people can use their gifts in the service of other people. That's what we offer. And to be perfectly honest, we really don't offer a whole lot beside that. We made this decision back in June of 2017 to move in this direction, and I'll tell you, and for those of you that have been here, you've seen it, I'll tell you, since June of 2017, we have seen God do some amazing things around this church. We have seen people right in this room on Sunday morning put their trust in Jesus for the very first time. I'm going to tell you something that I didn't get to say to the 9 a.m. because it didn't happen until after the 9 a.m. Somebody walked in here during the 9 a.m. service and gave their life to Jesus literally today. I love that when I say something like that, I don't have to tell you to get excited, because if that doesn't excite you, you're just not going to like it here. What that means, really think about this for a second. That means that individual at the 9 a.m. service, and I know that this is an uncomfortable thing to say in 2019, but whatever. That individual walked into this place headed for hell. They walked out of this place headed for heaven. I did not leave the fire department just to hear amen from the same group of Christians, Sunday in and Sunday out. Please don't take that wrong. I love you guys, but I want to see lives transformed by Jesus, and by God's grace, that's what we've seen. Man, 3 rounds of applause. Man, wow, what a great day. But for real, since 2017, we've seen people put their trust in Jesus for the first time. We've seen them get baptized. We've seen them go from attending on a Sunday to getting involved in a small. We've even seen people lead a small group who swore there ain't no chance they're ever going to do that. We've seen people serve. Case in point, by God's grace, we have seen lives transformed by Jesus. And since June of 2017, we've had a lot of new ideas and calls for new emphasis to kind of divert and change things and change the focus. And every single time, the vast majority of the time, we have to say no to those ideas. Not because they're bad ideas or wrong ideas or because we think we're smarter than the person offering those ideas. It's because we exist to do one thing. And if any idea distracts us from doing that one thing, we can't afford to implement it. So that's this principle applied kind of locally at our church. But like I said, not everybody thinks like that. Some people think that trusting God and having a plan don't go together. But what I see in this story is that nothing could be further from the truth. What I see in Nehemiah's life is that if you're serious about walking in obedience to the calling that God's placed on your life, you will have a plan. Not because you don't trust God, but because you care about what He's calling you to do. So here's what these verses demand we ask of ourselves. And I'll ask you, in light of what God is calling you to do, in light of God's vision for your life, what plan needs to be put in place to get there? Because here's something we all know. Everybody wants to have a healthy marriage. Everybody wants to arrive at a place of financial peace. Everybody wants to deal with their emotional baggage so it stops sabotaging their relationships. Everybody wants to have the satisfaction and the meaning and the purpose of knowing that they're walking right in the center of God's will for their life. But what not everybody's willing to do is to put a plan together to get from where they are to where God is calling them to be. Nehemiah refused to live that way because he knew that a vision without a plan is really just a fantasy. And so the second thing that we're shown in his life we have to do if we're going to walk in obedience to God's call in our life is, number 2, carefully make the plans. So what's next? If you can clearly define your mission and you've made plans in order to accomplish and walk in obedience to that mission, what's the next thing that you and I have to do? It's going to be our third idea this morning. Number 3, we have to honestly count the costs. All obedience is costly to the one who walks in obedience. And it's our responsibility to count that cost on the front end. I'll pick it up in verse 11, where it says, after I arrived in Jerusalem and had been there 3 days, so let me just pause there. Nehemiah has now traveled 1,000 miles from the Persian Empire in the city of Susa to Jerusalem. After I arrived in Jerusalem and had been there 3 days, I got up at night and took a few men with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God had laid on my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the one I was riding. I went out at night through the valley gate toward the serpent's well and the dung gate. Nobody's renting an Airbnb in the dung gate area. But here's why he went out. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. That's why he went out. I went on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but farther down, it became too narrow for my animal to go through, so I went up at night by way of the valley and inspected the wall. Then heading back, I entered through the valley gate and returned. The officials didn't know where I'd gone or what I was doing, for I had not yet told the Jews, priests, nobles, officials, or the rest of those who would be doing the work. So what you're reading there is that after arriving in Jerusalem, but before running his mouth to people, before getting involved himself, and before asking anybody else to get involved with this massive project, what Nehemiah did is just went out at night by himself to inspect those walls. And what he was doing was putting eyes on that project, putting his hands on that project so that he would have an idea of what it was that he was up against. In other words, what he was doing was he was counting the cost. It took, if you're here and you're new, one thing that I talk about all the time is I used to be a firefighter before I came here to be the pastor. It took me about 2.5 years to become a firefighter. And during those 2.5 years, I had a lot of friends that were cops, a lot of friends that were firefighters, and I would talk to them a lot about their line of work, just so I could kind of get a behind-the-scenes look and, sort of know what I'm getting myself into. And one thing that I noticed during that time of life, this always really stood out to me, is that almost without exception, every single cop that I talked to told me to be a firefighter. And almost without exception, every single firefighter I talked to told me to be a cop. And what was even weirder is that they all had basically the same reasons for telling me what they were telling me to do. So when I would talk to a cop, most of the time, the very first thing, if you're a county police officer, I think you probably know what I'm already going to say. The very first thing that they would say, kind of hold up as a reason that I should be a firefighter, is the schedule. Firefighters in Anne Arundel County have the greatest schedule in the world. We worked 24-hour shifts, and then we're off for 72 hours. So it boils down to like 8 shifts a month. And don't get me wrong, obviously the 24 hours can be pretty brutal, but you get 72 hours to recover from it. It's amazing. So that's the first thing they say, you got to be a firefighter, that schedule's great. And then they would usually talk about like, you guys are in a firehouse, there's that camaraderie, and it's like a family. Yeah, okay. And it's like a dorm room kind of thing, and whatever their perception of it was. But then thirdly, lastly, and really importantly, what every cop would remind me of is, hey, by the way, people like it when the fire department shows up, right? Like nobody ever cheers when the cops arrive. They run. And when the fire department shows up, everybody's like, throwing money at us. And I would get like, fireman t-shirts, and people would be thanking me for my service and like naming their kids after me and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't happen so much for, police officers. But then when I would talk to firefighters and they would say you got to be a cop, the first thing, and really the main thing I would say is, they got that car. That's so cool. You get your own car. You don't have to be in a stupid firehouse all day. It's like the Lone Ranger. You don't have a supervisor breathing down your neck, which I'm sure isn't true. I'm sure cops would say you deal with that anyway. And then the other big thing is they get a gun and they get to tell people what to do. Imagine a greater line of work than that. So they all had basically the same reasons. But what really stood out to me about that is that it demonstrates this really powerful principle, and it's this. Things always look more appealing to us from a distance. Like most of us go through life, I'd say about everybody goes through life perpetually kind of like envying, maybe having a low grade of jealousy, covetousness toward other people, because we all, when we stand and look at somebody else's life, we tend to just see the rosiest parts of their life. We don't see the hardest parts. And that's what has people, perpetually running through life exhausted, chasing this kind of perfect life that doesn't really exist. And not only do we do that with other people's lives, we even do it in our own lives. That's why people throughout the course of their life are always talking about the good old days. You know what's interesting about the good old days is they never seem good to us while we're in them. Right? Like nobody in high school is saying, I can't wait to be 45 and fondly looking back on these years. I'm going to miss them when they're gone. It just does be super weird, like an Uncle Rico kind of thing. It's just not how most people go through life. Napoleon Dynamite reference. Most people, they go through life constantly just trying to get through whatever it is they're going through, only to realize in hindsight, once they got some years behind them, that, man, those were the good old days, because things look so much better to us, so much more appealing from a distance. I bring all this up because it's for that exact reason that Nehemiah did what we're reading about here. See, the interesting thing about Nehemiah's life is that he was born in Persian captivity, meaning he'd never seen Jerusalem. He'd never seen those walls. God had a vision that he gave Nehemiah, and he gave Nehemiah this passion, and he had this burden, and he had all kind of fire in the furnace to go and do it, but Nehemiah had no idea the cost of walking in obedience to that vision. And so if he hadn't done what we see him doing here, which is going out and taking a deep breath and with real sober-mindedness, looking at the scope and the scale and the size of this project, you know what would have happened. He'd have rolled up his sleeves and been blindsided at what it really cost him. And one thing that we're really wise to remember, but I think at least I forget all too often, and maybe you can sympathize, is that it's really easy for us to stand from a distance. It's really easy for us to romanticize what a life surrendered to the will of God is. It's real easy to romanticize what it's going to be like when we're walking in obedience to our calling. But all of that veneer quickly fades when we start actually doing what it is that God's calling us to do. And once we get out there and we find out that it's not all rainbows and butterflies, if we haven't honestly counted the cost on the front end, we're going to burn out the moment that it stops being fun. And so what we see in Nehemiah, and I so admire him for this, is that after defining his mission and after making his plans and after making this 1,000-mile journey, but before doing anything else, and certainly before asking anybody else to get involved, he goes out by himself and he puts his eyes on this project, he puts his hands on this project, he counts the cost of this project. But even that is not all that we can learn from his example. So the question is, after you can clearly define your mission, you've made your plans and you've counted the cost, what's the last thing that you and I need to do if we're going to walk in obedience to the call that God's placed on our life? Based on this story, this is going to be our fourth, this is going to be our final idea this morning. We need to, number 4, boldly ask for help. Prior to this point in this story, if you really pay careful attention, prior to this point in this story, this has been a one-man show. It's been Nehemiah's burden, it's been Nehemiah's passion, it's been Nehemiah's prayer, it's been Nehemiah's request, Nehemiah's everything. But here when we pick it up in verse 17, we see Nehemiah doing something that way too many of us are terrible at. In verse 17, it says, "So I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned down. Come, let us rebuild Jerusalem's wall, so that we will no longer be a disgrace. I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me and what the king had said to me. And they said, let us start rebuilding. And they were encouraged to do this good work." The thing that so impresses me about this last part is how much humility it took on Nehemiah's part. It doesn't take a great deal of character to put a plan together, to state a mission, to count a cost. But it takes an incredible amount of character, an incredible amount of humility, an incredible amount just of self-awareness to be able to realize what Nehemiah realized, which is that we're not going to walk in obedience to the calling God's placed on our life by ourselves. So whatever it is that God is calling you to do, whatever that thing is, I know this, He's not calling you to do it alone. If it's fostering a child, if it's fixing your marriage, if it's dealing with sin in your life, if it's preaching the gospel, reaching out to somebody that God has so put on your heart, whatever it is, any individual who's ever walked in obedience to the call that God's placed on their life has needed the people of God in their life. And there's a story in the Old Testament that shows us exactly what this looks like. I love this story. It's from the book of Exodus chapter 17. In Exodus chapter 17, we have Moses leading the nation of Israel through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And in Exodus 17, the people of God arrived at this place called Rephidim. And when they were there, the Amalekites attacked God's people. And so Moses sent Joshua out with all the warriors to defend God's people. And Moses himself went to the top of a hill that sort of overlooked the battle. You can picture that scene. And he goes up to this hill with his brother Aaron and one of his closest friends and advisors, a guy named Hur. And this is what we read in Exodus 17, verse 11. It says, "While Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he put his hand down, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat down on it. Then Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until the sun went down. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword." The calling to lead God's people was given to Moses, and it was given to Moses alone. But what that story shows is that in order to walk in obedience to the calling that God had placed on his life, Moses needed people to hold up his arms when he no longer had the strength to do so. And whatever it is that God is calling you to do, I know this: it is only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time until your arms are too heavy for you to lift in and of your own power. And what I see in the story of Nehemiah, what I see in the story of Moses, what I see all over Scripture is that when you and I take a step of faith outside of our comfortable, self-centered little lives and take a step toward obedience, toward the life that God is calling us to, God will faithfully bring people into our lives to help us stand, to lift our arms when we can't do it ourselves. But it is our responsibility to do what we see Nehemiah do in this story. It is our responsibility to boldly ask for help. Let me call the teams up and we'll close today. With the end of this teaching, we're already halfway through this series, and so I thought it would be appropriate to end today's talk just by reminding us of the reason behind this series. This series is not about just doing things that need to be done. This series is not about just solving a social issue or working on our marriages. It's certainly not about following our hearts or whatever stupid tagline we could come up with. The purpose behind this series is finding and accomplishing God's will for our lives. And the reason that we do that, the reason that we look at the story of Nehemiah and we put into practice the things that we see in his life is not so we can be successful in our lives. It's so that God can be glorified through our lives. And I want to leave you today with a promise of what God can do through a life that's surrendered to him. And it's a promise that was given by Jesus himself. It's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. Jesus said, "In the same way, let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." Now, if you're here today and you follow Jesus, I'm willing to bet that there are people in your life that you have a burden for, that you care deeply about, that you want to see give their lives to Jesus. Maybe those people are your kids, maybe they're your parents, maybe it's your spouse, whoever it is. What Jesus just said is that one of the best ways for you and I to powerfully impact the people that God's placed in our lives with our faith is to simply walk unapologetically in obedience to the calling that he has placed on our life. A man named John Wesley, who is a man used unbelievably by God, once said, "Light yourself on fire with passion, and the world will come from miles to watch you burn." And all he was doing was paraphrasing the words of the Son of God here. Because by God's design, there are few things as influential and as powerful and as magnetic as an individual that walks unapologetically in the center of God's will for their life. So how do you do that? How do you walk in obedience to God's will for your life? Number one, you have to be able to clearly define your mission, because you cannot do what you cannot define. Then you have to carefully make the plans, because a vision without a plan is just a fantasy. Then you have to honestly count the cost, because all obedience is costly. And fourthly and lastly, you have to boldly ask for help, because every one of us is going to need somebody to hold our arms up sooner rather than later. But as we do that, we remember that it's the life that we live that Jesus said can act as a light shining to those who are right now still living in darkness. And the hope that we have as we follow hard after God's will for our lives is that it's through our life that people will see our good works and not glorify us because we're not all that great. We needed saving. That through us they might see our good works and glorify our Father, the one Father who sent his Son to die so that we could live for him. That's it. That's all.